The funeral was held on a Tuesday, which felt wrong somehow, like grief should at least have the decency to arrive on a weekend when the world was already slow and quiet. But death kept its own calendar, and so Elena Vasquez found herself standing in front of her closet at 7 a.m, staring at clothes that didn't know how to mourn. The black dress she'd worn to her aunt's funeral 3 years ago had been donated last spring, back when she'd believed decluttering her apartment might declutter her life. The dark navy blouse had a wine stain near the hem she'd never managed to remove. Everything else was color. Mustard yellow, forest green, a floral wrap dress that looked like it belonged at a garden party. And the red dress. She'd bought it on a whim, the kind of purchase that made sense at 9 p.m. under flattering store lighting and made no sense at all by morning. Deep crimson, fitted at the waist, falling just below the knee. Elegant in the way that commanded rooms. She had worn it exactly once, to a work dinner where she'd wanted to feel less invisible. It had worked too well. She'd spent the whole evening deflecting compliments and wishing she'd chosen something quieter. But it was the only clean thing left that didn't have a stain or a broken zipper, and the funeral was in 2 hours, and her mother was waiting outside in the car. Elena put on the red dress. She told herself nobody would notice. The service was for her father's colleague, a man named Hargreaves, who had been kind to her once at a company Christmas party 7 years ago, pressing a glass of warm cider into her hands when he'd seen her standing alone near the window. She had attended perhaps 4 company events in her life. She barely knew these people. She would stand at the back, pay her respects, leave quietly, and the red dress would be something she'd laugh about later with her best friend over cheap wine. She did not expect the church to be this large. She did not expect this many people. And she absolutely did not expect the man standing at the top of the stone steps. He wasn't part of the funeral procession. He wasn't greeting mourners or handing out programs. He was simply standing there, slightly apart from everything else. The way old buildings stood apart from modern ones, not removed, but belonging to a different category of permanence entirely. He wore a dark suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who had always owned expensive things, effortlessly, without trying. His hair was black, longer than most men wore it, brushed back from a face that seemed designed to make artists reach for their brushes. High cheekbones, a jaw that could have been drawn with a ruler, eyes that were dark and still and currently, with no apparent effort at concealment, fixed entirely on her. Elena looked away, looked back. He was still watching. She tugged the hem of her dress and wished it were black. Her mother touched her arm. "You look lovely," her mother whispered, clearly believing this was reassurance. It was not reassurance. It was confirmation that the red dress was doing exactly what the red dress did, which was refuse to be ignored. They found seats near the left aisle, 3 rows from the back. The church smelled of old wood and candle smoke and chrysanthemums, which Elena had always thought was a strange flower for sorrow, too white, too structured, as if grief needed to be organized. She focused on the order of service, on the vicar's steady voice beginning the opening prayer, on her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not look at the man on the steps again. Except she did, once when the congregation rose for the first hymn. He had moved inside the church without her noticing and was standing along the side wall, unhurried and apart, as if pews were optional and attendance had a different meaning for him, and his gaze, which should have been directed at the altar or the vicar, or literally anywhere appropriate for a funeral, was directed at her. Not in the way men sometimes looked at women in red dresses. Not with that particular species of appraisal that felt like being assessed for purchase. This was something else entirely. Something older and more patient, like the way historians looked at artifacts they recognized but couldn't yet explain. Elena faced forward and concentrated on the hymn and reminded herself she didn't know this man, and this was a funeral, and whatever she was feeling was almost certainly the accumulated anxiety of wearing inappropriate clothing in a sacred space. The service lasted 40 minutes. Elena stood when she was meant to stand, sat when she was meant to sit, and managed not to look at the side wall more than twice. Both times, he was still there. Both times, he was still watching. Afterward, the mourners filtered out into the gray October afternoon for the graveside committal. Elena guided her mother through the crowd, nodding at her father's colleagues she half recognized, accepting small, sad smiles with her own. The ground was soft from last night's rain, and her heels kept sinking slightly with each step, which meant she was concentrating very hard on not twisting an ankle when she heard a voice beside her. "You're going to ruin those shoes." She looked up. He was closer than she'd expected, standing perhaps 2 feet away, adjusting his own path to match hers without making it obvious he was doing so. Up close, something was different about him. Not wrong, exactly. Just different in a way she couldn't immediately catalog. His skin was very pale, with the particular quality of old marble, not unhealthy, not fragile, the opposite of fragile, and his eyes, which she'd thought were dark brown from a distance, were something else entirely. A deep layered black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, ringed at the edges with something that was almost silver. She realized she had been staring. "I'm managing," Elena said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. "You are," he agreed, against considerable odds. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing and kept walking, and he walked alongside her, as if she had invited him, which she had not, and somehow, she didn't tell him to leave. She would wonder about that later. Why she hadn't told him to leave. The graveside was a quieter kind of grief than the church. Inside, the architecture and the ritual held everything at a manageable distance. Out here, under the low October sky with the raw earth turned and the plain wooden coffin being carried by 6 steady men, there was nowhere to put the feeling except directly in your chest, where it sat. Heavy and specific. Elena stood beside her mother and watched people cry who had known Hargreaves properly, who had eaten dinner at his table and argued with him and borrowed tools from his garage and called him when things went wrong. Her grief was smaller and borrowed, a second-hand sorrow for a man who had once handed her warm cider on a cold evening and asked what she did for work, as if her answer genuinely interested him. Small kindnesses were their own category of loss. The man in the dark suit was standing across from her, on the other side of the grave. She noticed this because it was geometrically difficult not to notice. The mourners had formed a rough oval around the grave, and he occupied a position directly in her sightline, which meant that every time she looked toward the coffin, or the vicar, or the flowers banked at the head of the grave, she was also looking approximately at him. He was not, as far as she could tell, looking at the coffin, or the vicar, or the flowers. Elena made a decision to be mature and composed, and to not let a stranger's attention disrupt her ability to pay respects at a funeral, however inadvertent her attendance in a red dress might have been. She focused on the vicar's words, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, words so old they had worn smooth, like river stones, the meaning present in the weight of them rather than their surface. She thought about her father, who would have known the right thing to say today. She thought about her mother, who had insisted on coming because Hargreaves had been kind to their family, and kindness deserved to be witnessed all the way to its end. She did not think about the man across the grave. Except, of course, she did. When the service ended and the mourners began the quiet dispersal of people who didn't know whether to linger or leave, Elena took her mother's arm and began the careful heel-sinking walk back across the soft grass toward the path. She had almost convinced herself she would leave without further incident when her mother's shoe caught on a raised tree root, and her mother lurched sideways, and Elena caught her, both of them half laughing, half alarmed, and when Elena looked up to make sure no one had witnessed this small, ungraceful moment, the only person looking was him. And this time, he walked over. "Steady ground is along the east path," he said, and his voice was the same temperature as the October air, cool and clear with a depth to it that suggested it could carry further than he was letting it. "The grass doesn't drain well near the old section." Elena's mother, who had the social instincts of someone who had never once met a stranger, smiled warmly. "Thank you. We'll remember that." "Are you family of Gerald's?" Something passed across his face. Not discomfort, more like the careful selection of a precise answer from a longer one. "I knew him a long time ago," he said. "We lost touch. I wanted to pay my respects." Her mother nodded with the solemn approval she reserved for people doing the right thing. He was a good man, very kind. Elena's father worked with him for years. She looked at Elena expectantly, the way she always did when she wanted Elena to participate in human interaction. "Elena," Elena said, because apparently that was all she had. He looked at her, the silver-ringed eyes, patient as museum paintings. "Dorian," he said. Her mother made a sound that suggested she found this exchange charming. Elena found it something else, unnerving in a way that had no sensible origin, like the feeling of standing in a very old building and sensing all the years compressed into its walls. He was, she told herself firmly, just a man at a funeral, possibly a distant relative or an old colleague paying quiet respects. The watching was unusual, fine, but she was wearing a red dress to a funeral. She was the visually unusual one here. They walked to the east path, and the ground was indeed more solid. Her mother asked Dorian quiet questions in the way of older women who understood that funerals required conversation to make them survivable, and Dorian answered with a careful courtesy of someone long practiced at social navigation. He had known Hargreaves in business, he said, many years ago. He was passing through the city and had seen the notice. He did not elaborate on what passing through meant for a man with no visible grief and eyes like layered midnight. Elena's mother eventually spotted her father's former secretary and excused herself, pressing Elena's arm meaningfully as she went. The meaning being, "Talk to this interesting man. Elena, I raised you to be sociable." So Elena stood beside Dorian on the east path, with the funeral dispersing around them and the October light going thin and gold through the trees, and she said the first honest thing that came to her. "You were watching me during the service." He didn't deny it or perform surprise. He simply looked at her with that same even attention. "Yes." "It was noticeable," she said. "I imagine it was. Most people would apologize for that." "Most people would look away," he said. "I found I couldn't." He said it simply, without flattery's usual performance. Not as a line. As a fact reported, she had the strange feeling he was being more honest with her in this sentence than most people managed in hours of conversation. Elena looked at the trees, at the last few mourners moving toward the car park, at the flowers still banked at the grave across the grass. "Why?" she asked. Dorian was quiet for a moment, a considered pause, not an evasive one. "You wore red because you had nothing else," he said, "and you walked in anyway. You sat at the back, and kept your eyes forward, and you thought no one would look at you." Another pause. That was never going to be true. Elena didn't know what to say to that either. She seemed to be collecting things she didn't know how to answer. "My car is just past the gate," her mother called from 20 yards away, waving pleasantly and pretending she hadn't been watching this entire exchange. "No hurry, darling." Elena looked back at Dorian, who was watching her with the patience of someone who had waited a very long time for something and had learned not to rush the last part of it. "I should go," she said. "Yes," he agreed and did not move. She almost asked for his number. She almost didn't move either. In the end, she walked toward her mother and the car, and she did not look back, and the feeling that followed her all the way home and sat with her through dinner and kept her awake until past midnight was not attraction exactly, or not only that. It was the feeling of having been seen completely by someone who had no reason to look and every apparent intention of continuing to do so. She did not expect to see him again. She saw him again on Thursday. The coffee shop on the corner of Marsh Street had been Elena's morning ritual for 3 years. Same corner table when it was available. Same order. Americano, an extra shot, oat milk on the side, because she liked to decide how much herself. The barista named Cleo knew her order before she reached the counter and had it ready by the time she'd unbuttoned her coat. It was one of the small, reliable anchors of her week, the kind of ordinary continuity that became precious, precisely because it asked nothing of her. Dorian was sitting at the table by the window. Not her corner table. The one near the front, which caught the morning light that came low and sideways through the glass at this time of year. He had a black coffee and a book, and the particular quality of stillness that she'd noticed at the funeral. Not the stillness of someone waiting for something, but the stillness of someone entirely comfortable existing without performing existence. He turned a page as she walked in. Then he looked up, as if he'd heard something the room hadn't. His eyes found her immediately. Elena considered leaving, considered pretending she hadn't seen him, considered the Americano Cleo was already beginning to make. She crossed to the counter, collected her coffee, and walked to his table. "You're not following me," she said. It came out more as a question than she'd intended. "No," Dorian said. He set the book face down. "I've been coming here for some time. Before Tuesday." A pause. "Though I appreciate the clarity." She looked at the book. Something old, the spine worn smooth, the title in a language she didn't immediately recognize. Not a prop, not something chosen to appear interesting. A book that had been read many times by someone who needed what was inside it. "May I sit?" Elena asked. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat and wrapped her hands around her cup, and looked at him properly for the first time, without a funeral as context. He looked the same. That was its own kind of strange. People usually looked less than their first impression once you examined them without the novelty of their newness. He looked exactly the same. Pale and still and quietly attentive, with those layered dark eyes that did that thing she still couldn't describe accurately. Absorbing rather than reflecting. "What are you reading?" she asked. He turned the book over so she could see. She didn't recognize the language. The letters were familiar, Latin characters, but the words were arranged in a pattern she'd never encountered. "Romanian," he said. A very old text. History, mostly. Though history and myth were not well separated at the time of its writing. You read Romanian. Among other languages. She waited for the list, the way people usually provided lists of their accomplishments given an opening. But he just watched her, and the list didn't come. "How many?" she asked. He considered this with the same careful selection she'd noticed at the funeral, enough to read the things I want to read in the language they were originally written. Elena smiled despite herself. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." And something in his expression shifted. The same almost smile from the stone steps. Warmer now. 14, he said. Living ones. Several that no longer have living speakers. She thought about the kind of life that required 14 languages, and decided it was probably a long life, or an unusually deliberate one, or both. "What do you do?" she asked. "When you're not reading old books in coffee shops and attending funerals for people you knew long ago." "I manage a number of properties," he said. "Estates, mostly. Some historical. I have an interest in preservation." His gaze moved to the window briefly, to the street outside where the morning was getting on with itself, in the ordinary way mornings did. Things that have lasted a long time deserve to continue lasting. "You like old things," Elena said. "I find new things temporary," he said. "They don't survive their own novelty." He looked at her again, though I'm willing to be wrong about that. The coffee shop filled and emptied around them. Cleo shot Elena a look from behind the counter that said various things, all of them the sort a best friend said with their eyebrows when their friend was talking to a beautiful and unusual man. Elena ignored the eyebrows. She was having a conversation that felt different from most conversations, not in the performed way of someone trying to be interesting, but in the substantive way of two people who were actually saying things to each other. She told him she was a translator. Technical documents mostly, legal and medical, English to Spanish and back. Occasionally literary work when it came, which it didn't often. He asked what she was working on currently, with the focused interest of someone who actually wanted to know, and she told him about the pharmaceutical brief she'd been staring at for a week that had a specific term resistant to clean translation, and he asked a question about it that was precise enough to surprise her. "You know something about pharmacology," she said. "I've had cause to," he said, and left it there. She should have left at 9:15. She left at 10:40, which meant she spent the rest of the morning catching up on work with her coffee gone cold, and found that she didn't particularly mind. He had not asked for her number. As she'd left, she'd wondered if he would, and he hadn't, and she'd spent approximately half of her walk home deciding this was fine and mature, and perhaps he was simply a man she'd had coffee with once, and the funeral had made things feel more significant than they were. She was good at this. Reframing the inexplicable into the reasonable. It was practically a professional skill. Her phone had buzzed while she was making lunch, a message from a number she didn't have saved. The word you're looking for in the pharmaceutical brief is desensibilization in its clinical usage, though you likely know that. I wanted an excuse to continue the conversation. She had stood in her kitchen holding a bread knife and smiling at her phone for longer than was strictly necessary. She saved the number under the name Dorian and replied, "You could have just asked." His response came after a pause that felt considered rather than tactical. "I find directness is easier the second time." She thought about that, about a man who seemed to have done everything for a very long time, for whom first impressions carried their own particular weight, for whom the second time was when the guard came slightly down. "Same coffee shop," she typed. "Saturday morning?" "I'll be there," he wrote back. "I'll have the table by the window." She went back to her pharmaceutical brief and found the clinical usage and translated it cleanly, and worked for 3 hours without stopping, and the whole time there was something warm sitting in her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. Saturday became a ritual without either of them formally deciding it would. The table by the window. His black coffee, her Americano with oat milk on the side. Books, or sometimes no books. Conversations that started with something small. A news story, a word that resisted translation, a question about the old building across the street, and then went somewhere else entirely. Somewhere neither of them had planned on going when the morning started. Elena learned things about Dorian in the way you learned things about people who were careful with information, not through declarations, but through accumulation. Small pieces, offered without ceremony. He had lived in this city before, many years ago, and had come back because cities with enough age kept their own gravity. He found crowds manageable only in small doses. He cooked, badly, and had never particularly improved, because improvement required the belief that you'd be cooking for long enough that skill was worth developing. He said this without apparent sadness, but Elena filed it somewhere, and thought about it later. He asked questions the way people did when they were actually listening, not waiting for their turn to speak, not cataloging your answers for use in a later point they were building toward. Simply listening, and then asking the next honest question that the listening produced. Elena, who had spent years translating other people's words and very few years being asked about her own, found this disorienting in a way that took a few Saturdays to get used to. She told him things she didn't usually tell people. About her father's death 2 years ago, and the particular loneliness of grief that didn't have a clean end. About the literary translation she'd turned down once because she'd been afraid she wasn't good enough, and had regretted it since in the specific recurring way of choices that showed you who you were, and you hadn't liked the answer. About how she'd bought the red dress because she'd wanted to feel less invisible, and had then been too frightened to wear it anywhere that mattered. Dorian listened to all of it. "You wore it to the funeral," he said. "Because I had nothing else," Elena said. "That's what you told yourself," he said. "But you also kept it. For 2 years you kept a dress you were afraid to wear. That's not nothing. That's a particular kind of hope." She looked at him, at the October and coffee shop light falling across his face in its strange, too perfect way. "You make a lot of sense of other people," she said. "What about yourself?" The careful pause, the selection. "I find it harder," he said, "to see yourself clearly when you've been the same person for a very long time." "Nobody stays the same," Elena said. "No," he agreed, and something moved behind his eyes that she didn't have the language for yet. Some people change more slowly than others. She thought about this on the walk home. The accumulation of small pieces was building a picture she kept trying to name, and couldn't quite. He was private in a way that felt different from most people's privacy, which was usually the protection of things that were soft and woundable. His privacy felt like the protection of something vast, not hidden because it was shameful, hidden because it was too large for ordinary conversations, because bringing it out in full required more than coffee shop light and 2 hours on a Saturday morning. She was not, Elena told herself firmly, falling in love with a man she'd known for 3 weeks. She was simply, she allowed, in a state of sustained interest unusual enough to require monitoring. The 4th Saturday, he walked her home. It started because the weather changed abruptly, the way London weather did, from cold and clear to cold, and pouring in the time it took to drink a second coffee. Elena had not brought an umbrella. Dorian produced one from somewhere. She hadn't seen it arrive. It was simply there when they stepped outside, large and black and sufficient for 2 people if they walked reasonably close. She did not examine the umbrella's provenance. She accepted the proximity it required. They walked slowly. His pace adjusted to hers without comment. He asked about a building they passed that she'd never noticed, despite walking the street 3 times a week, a narrow Georgian townhouse wedged between 2 larger ones, its facade still original, its windows old glass that distorted the reflections. She said she'd never paid attention to it. Most people don't, he said. Things that have been there long enough stop being seen. They become part of the background. He looked at the building with an expression she couldn't fully read. Sometimes they prefer it that way. Do you? Alana asked. He looked at her. Rain on the umbrella, the close warm space beneath it. I did, he said, for a long time. It seemed safer. A pause. I'm finding that preference is changing. They reached her building. She should say thank you and good night, and she would see him on Saturday. She should go inside and make dinner and be sensible, and not read things into umbrella logistics and precise answers to straightforward questions. Do you want to come up? Elena said. Dorian looked at her building's front door. Then, at her. Yes, he said. Very much. Something in how he said it, the simple honesty of it, the absence of performance, made her breath catch in a way she'd been carefully not acknowledging for several Saturdays. She led him up the stairs to the 3rd floor and unlocked the door and stepped back to let him in, and he stopped in the doorway before he crossed the threshold, and she thought for a moment something flickered across his face, the nearest thing to uncertainty she'd seen there, and then it resolved, and he came inside. Her apartment was what it was, small, dense with books and the faint evidence of a life organized around language. Dictionaries in 4 languages on the shelf above the desk. A translation project spread across the table, red dress visible through the open wardrobe door because she hadn't gotten around to properly hanging it. He noticed the dress. She saw him notice it. Still kept, he said. Still kept, Alana agreed. She made tea because that was what you did, and also because it gave her something to do with her hands. He stood by the bookshelf and read spines and occasionally asked questions, and when she brought the tea he was sitting on the small sofa that barely fit 2 people comfortably, and she sat beside him, and that was the fact of it. The 2 of them with tea in a small apartment with rain against the windows, and everything quiet and particular and beginning. Elena, he said, after a while. Yes, she said. I need to tell you something, he said. The careful voice, but with something underneath it now, something that had been in the vicinity all along and was moving closer to the surface. About myself. About what I am. He looked at the window. At the rain. I've been trying to find the right time for 3 weeks, and there is no right time. There is only a time that is fair. She looked at him, at the pale marble skin, and the light-absorbing eyes, and the stillness that was not the stillness of an ordinary man, at all the small pieces she'd been accumulating, and the picture they'd been building that she hadn't let herself name. Tell me, she said, and her voice was steadier than she'd expected, because somewhere below rational thought she already knew she was about to hear something that would change the geometry of her life, and the strangest part was that she wasn't afraid. He told her simply, not with theater or gradual revelation designed to manage her reaction. He told her the way he answered questions, directly, and with the understanding that she deserved the real version rather than a softer one edited for easier digestion. He was not, as she had known him for 4 weeks, a man of 35 or 40. He was not a man who managed properties, because it was a reasonable career for someone educated and private and interested in old things. He was the reason the properties had existed long enough to require managing. He had been alive, in the particular way that he was alive, for 860 years. He had been born in the mountains of what was now Romania, in a winter that no living person remembered, in a world that had since remade itself so many times as to be unrecognizable. He had not aged past the morning of his 30th year. He did not require sleep in the way she required sleep, did not eat in the way she ate. He required blood, taken carefully and without harm, because he had long since decided that the manner of his survival was something he controlled, and he controlled it with the precision of someone who understood what carelessness cost. He was a vampire. He said the word plainly, without apology or drama, and watched her face with the attention of someone who understood they had no right to ask for a particular response, and was simply, honestly, waiting for whatever the true one was. Elena sat with it. She was a woman who worked in language, who spent her days finding the correct word for a thing, who understood that the wrong word for the right thing was its own kind of dishonesty. She looked at Dorian, at the pale stillness, the too perfect face, the eyes that absorbed rather than reflected, and she went through the evidence she had accumulated, all the small things that hadn't resolved correctly under ordinary explanation, the way he moved, fluid and entirely soundless. The cold of his hands she'd noticed when she'd passed him his tea, not uncomfortable, not alarming, simply different. The way the shadows near him seemed to sit slightly differently than shadows elsewhere. The fact that in 4 weeks she had never once seen him eat. The coffee, she said. Untouched, he confirmed. I ordered it because you would have felt observed otherwise. The languages. You accumulate things across 8 centuries, he said. Languages were useful. She looked at the window, at the rain that had softened to a steady gray misting. Why are you telling me now? Because I would like to know you better, he said. And that isn't possible without this. What I am shapes everything, how I live, how carefully I move through the world, what I can offer you and what I cannot. I'm not able to have you understand me without having you understand this first. And if I ask you to leave, Elena said. I leave, he said immediately, without argument, without attempting to change your mind. You owe me nothing. You never did. She looked at him. You've told people before. Something old moved through his expression. Not quite grief. The feeling of grief after grief had finished when only the shape remained. Once, he said, a very long time ago. It did not go well. What happened? The pause was longer this time. She was frightened, he said, which was reasonable. And then she was angry, which was also reasonable. And then I was alone again, which was also reasonable, and simply very hard. He looked at his hands. I spent 200 years deciding it wasn't worth the attempt, and then I spent another 400 years being certain of it. A pause. And then I saw a woman walk into a funeral in a red dress. Elena felt something move in her chest. Something that had been still for a very long time. That's not a good reason, she said. No, he agreed, but it was sufficient. She got up, walked to the window, stood with her hands pressed to the cool glass, and looked at the wet street below, the amber of the street lamps catching in the puddles, the ordinary ongoing life of a Thursday evening in a city that had been a city for 1,000 years, and would be one for 1,000 more. She thought about her father, who had died on an ordinary Tuesday, about kindnesses small enough to fit in a cup of warm cider, about a red dress kept in a wardrobe, for 2 years, because you weren't ready yet. I'm not frightened, she said. She heard the quality of his silence change. I'm not, she continued, saying that because I think I should be brave. I'm saying it because it's true. I've been sitting here listening and running through everything I know about you and trying to find the part that feels wrong. And it doesn't. She turned. He was watching her with an expression she'd never seen on his face. The careful control present still, but something underneath it. Something that had been waiting behind the careful control for a very long time. You make sense to me, she said. All of it. You have always made sense to me, and I think I've been trying not to notice. Dorian stood, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who didn't trust sudden movements in important moments. Elena, he said. I have questions, she said. A considerable number. I'd like to ask them. Yes, he said. And I'd like you to stay, she said. For tea and for questions. And we'll see what comes after that. He crossed the room, stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the distinct cool of the air around him, which she now understood differently, and which she found she didn't mind at all. He lifted a hand, slowly, and touched the back of her hand where it rested against the window glass. His fingers were cool and precise, and entirely gentle. I find, he said quietly, that I'm looking forward to the questions. She smiled. He watched the smile with the attention he'd brought to everything, the patient-focused interest that she'd thought at first was unusual, and now understood was simply who he was, someone who had learned that time was not short, and attention was not scarce, and the things worth looking at were worth looking at properly. She made more tea. He sat back on the sofa, and she sat beside him, and she asked him everything she wanted to know, and he answered all of it. And the rain kept on outside, and the apartment was warm. And somewhere in the middle of the fourth question, his hand found hers on the cushion between them, and neither of them moved it. The questions took 3 evenings. She approached it the way she approached translation, systematically, honestly, without deciding in advance what she wanted the answer to be. What did he eat? How often? How did he find it? Was there pain involved for the other person? How did he sleep and where? What happened to him in sunlight? Could he be killed? Did he want to be sometimes, after 8 centuries of watching everything he knew become history? He answered all of it. Sunlight weakened him significantly, stripped the strength and the speed and left him manageable rather than ordinary. But it did not kill him. That particular piece of mythology had been useful to his kind, and had been encouraged accordingly. He slept, though rarely and briefly, and not in a coffin, which she hadn't actually thought, but apparently enough people assumed that it was worth preemptively clarifying. Blood he took from willing donors, a small network of people who understood what he was, and offered their assistance for reasons that were their own, and which he compensated fairly and without coercion. He said this carefully, watching her face, and she believed him because she'd been watching him for 5 weeks, and coercion was not a thing she'd seen evidence of in him. Could he be killed? He looked at her steadily when she asked this. Yes, he said, with sufficient effort. I prefer not to elaborate on the mechanics. She accepted this. It was, she thought, a reasonable privacy. Did he want to be? Sometimes. The longest pause of all. He was quiet for a full minute, which she let him have. There are periods, he said finally, across a very long life, when the weight of continuity becomes substantial, when you have outlived everything familiar enough times that familiarity itself begins to feel pointless. A careful breath. I have had those periods. They pass. Something always, he seemed to search for the word, intervenes. Something new that makes the weight feel manageable again. What intervened this time? Elena asked. He looked at her with the layered eyes and the particular steadiness that she had stopped finding unnerving and now found simply, specifically, his. You know what intervened, he said. She did know. She had known since the Tuesday in the churchyard with the soft ground and the October light and a feeling of being seen completely by someone who had no reason to look. She simply hadn't said it yet, because saying it made it real, and real things could be lost. And she was still, somewhere beneath the translator's habit of precision, a person who'd learned to protect herself from the weight of hope. On the 3rd evening, she asked the last question. What do you want? She said. From this. From me. I'd like you to be completely honest. Dorian sat with this, the careful selection but deeper than usual, as if he was going all the way down to find the true answer rather than stopping at the available one. I want to know you, he said, as fully and for as long as you are willing to be known. I want to be present for whatever your life becomes." A pause. I have spent 800 years becoming very good at keeping myself separate from things I might lose. I would like, I think, to stop being so good at that. Elena looked at him, at the 860-year-old man on her small sofa who had ordered untouched coffee for 5 Saturdays because otherwise she would feel observed. "Okay," she said. He looked at her carefully. "Okay," he repeated. "Yes," she said. "Let's do this. Let's be whatever this is. I don't need to name it yet. I just need to know. We're both in it." "We are," he said, with the simple certainty of someone who had spent 8 centuries learning what he meant when he said something. "We have been, I think, since Tuesday." She laughed. Actually laughed, and the laugh was surprised and real, and he watched it with an expression she now recognized as his equivalent of joy. Not exuberant, not performed, but deep and particular. The joy of something arriving that had been awaited with patience and without certainty. November arrived, and the city settled into its gray and gold. They moved through it differently now, the coffee shop on Saturday mornings, with the acknowledged understanding of what this was, and evenings at her apartment, with the questions finished and the simply being together begun. He was, she discovered, unexpectedly funny. A dry humor that arrived without warning. Observations so precisely calibrated that she laughed before she'd finished hearing them. It was the humor of someone who had watched human nature long enough to find it genuinely, affectionately absurd. She learned the feel of his cool hands, the particular stillness that settled over her apartment when he was in it, like weather that had decided to remain. She learned that he had opinions about architecture and none about popular music, that he had read everything and watched very little, that he found modern cities interesting, but had a specific grief for the ones he'd known before, which was a grief she couldn't entirely share, but could sit with him in, which was perhaps sufficient. He met her mother at a Sunday lunch her mother had organized with the transparent innocence of a woman who wanted to examine the man her daughter was seeing. He navigated it with the same careful courtesy he brought to everything. Her mother fed him, which Elena watched with private amusement, because he ate what was put before him with the equanimity of someone who had developed useful skills across a very long life, and her mother, who assessed people's characters through their appetite, decided he was a little reserved but essentially good. "He looks at you," her mother said quietly when Dorian was in the other room, "the way your father used to look at me. Like you're the thing in the room that everything else is organized around." Elena didn't say anything. She went to the kitchen and stood at the window for a moment with her hand on the counter and let the feeling be what it was. In December, the city put its lights up, and Elena walked through them beside Dorian, who found the lights more useful than the darkness and less presumptuous than the sun, and she told him about her father's habit of standing in front of the Christmas tree every year with a glass of whiskey and simply looking at it for 10 minutes without saying anything. And Dorian listened, and then said her father sounded like someone who understood that some things only worked if you didn't try to improve them. "He would have liked you," Elena said. Dorian was quiet for a moment. "I would have been very careful with that," he said. "The liking." She took his hand, cool and still and entirely hers. "I know," she said. Christmas came, and the question it brought was one Elena hadn't thought to prepare for. She was staying with her mother for 3 days. A small terraced house in a quiet part of the city, familiar in the way childhood homes were familiar, not always comfortable, but known in the bones. She would sleep in her old room with the too-soft mattress, and the window that let in the sound of the neighbors' wind chimes. She would eat too much, and watch old films, and help her mother with things the house needed doing, and she would be home in the way that home was complicated after loss. Dorian would be alone. She hadn't asked him about it directly, but she'd arrived at the understanding gradually. He had no family. In the particular meaning the word had acquired across 8 centuries. He had acquaintances, people scattered across various cities who knew what he was and maintained the careful mutual accommodation of long shared knowledge. But Christmas as it existed in the domestic sense, the crowded kitchen, the overlapping conversations, the specific exhaustion of too many people in too small a space, that was not his, had not been for a very long time. She asked him 2 days before. "What will you do?" "Read," he said. "The evenings are long. I find it restful. You could come," she said. "Not for all 3 days, necessarily, but Christmas Day. My mother would like it. She's already suggested it twice through what she believes is subtle hinting." He looked at her. "Elena." "She knows you don't eat very much," Elena said. "I told her you have a medical condition that affects appetite. She accepted this and has already planned 3 dishes she believes are sufficiently light. She will be genuinely hurt if you don't come." "You told your mother I have a medical condition," he said. "I told my mother something that is functionally accurate," she said. "You don't eat in the conventional sense. That's a condition." The almost smile. "That is a remarkable piece of translation." "It's my profession," she said. He came on Christmas Day. He arrived with wine he'd selected with the expertise of someone who'd been drinking it since before the vineyard existed, and her mother received it with pleasure and put him to work chopping vegetables because she believed in making people useful, and it turned out Dorian could chop vegetables with the focused efficiency of someone who had done it for a very long time. Alana stood in the kitchen doorway and watched, and felt something move through her that was warm and specific and not at all subtle. After dinner, her mother fell asleep in the armchair with the television on, which was the traditional Christmas Day outcome, and Alana and Dorian sat side by side on the small sofa in the particular way they had, close enough that his shoulder was against hers. "Thank you for coming," Elena said. "Thank you for asking," he said. He said it with the weight of someone for whom the invitation was not small, who understood what it meant to be brought inside the ordinary domestic warmth of someone's life, and to be treated as if you belonged there. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The cool of him, familiar now and right. He stayed entirely still in the way that meant he was present, at full attention. Outside, the wind chimes moved in the neighbor's garden. Her mother made a small sleeping sound. "Dorian," Elena said. "Yes." "I love you," she said. "I've been not saying it for a month because I was deciding whether it was a real thing or a proximity thing, and I've decided it's a real thing, and I think you should know." He was quiet for a long moment. The quality of his silence was different, not the considering kind, not the selecting kind. Something she hadn't heard from him before. She lifted her head to look at him. His expression was open in a way she'd never seen it. The careful control still present, but thinner, letting something through that had been behind it all along. His eyes were very bright. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you walked into that churchyard in a red dress and looked away from me, and then looked back." "That's a month and a half," Alana said. "Yes," he said. "Which is—" He stopped. "Elena, I have spent 8 centuries deciding that certain things were no longer available to me. Love, specifically. The kind that is particular and chosen and present every morning. I had very good reasons. The reasons are still true." He took her hand. And somehow, entirely insufficient. She kissed him, the first time, and the cool of his lips, and the way his hand came to her face with the same precision and gentleness it brought to everything. He kissed her back with the careful deliberateness of someone for whom this was not casual, had never been casual, would never be casual. She felt the strength of him, the contained and ancient power of him, held with extraordinary care specifically for her. When they pulled apart, her mother was still asleep. The television was showing something with sleigh bells. "What does this mean?" Elena asked quietly. "Practically. For what happens next." "It means," Dorian said, "that we move carefully. That we are honest with each other about what each of us needs. That we do not pretend this is uncomplicated, because it isn't." He looked at their joined hands. "I am what I am. You are what you are. There are things in that difference that will require navigation." "Tell me the hardest one," she said. He was very still. "You will age," he said. "I will not. That is not a distant concern. It begins now, slowly, and it ends in a place I cannot follow you to." He didn't look away from her face. I cannot change what I am. I would not ask you to change what you are. But this is the thing I cannot make easier, and you deserve to know it is the center of the difficulty. She held his gaze. I know, she said. I've known since you told me. She turned her hand so their fingers interlaced properly. I'm not interested in easy. I'm interested in real. A pause. We have now. Whatever now is, however long it runs. That's not nothing. No, he said. His hand tightened on hers. It is very far from nothing. Her mother stirred and woke, and looked at them with the serene satisfaction of a woman whose hinting had produced visible results. More tea? She said. Please, said Dorian, and Elena laughed, and the wind chimes went on outside, and the evening was what it was, small and warm and real. January brought a problem. It arrived in the form of a man named Marcus, which was not his name in the way that Dorian was not Dorian's first name, but the name he currently used for current business. Elena learned about him the way she learned most things now, through accumulation, through the small shifts in Dorian's manner that she had become, over 4 months, fluent enough to read. He arrived at the coffee shop one Saturday. Not to their table, he took a seat across the room and ordered nothing, and read a newspaper that he didn't look at. Elena noticed him because he was noticeable in the way Dorian was noticeable, that quality of occupying space differently, of having a particular kind of stillness that was not the stillness of ordinary men resting. But where Dorian's stillness was inward and warm in its depths, this man's stillness was external and cold all the way down. Dorian had seen him the moment he'd walked in. Elena knew this because Dorian's hand, which had been resting easily on the table near hers, became very slightly still in a new way. Not tensed. Carefully, deliberately not tensed, which was its own kind of information. She didn't say anything in the coffee shop. Outside, on the pavement, she asked. Dorian was quiet for the length of half a street. His name is Marcus, he said. He is of my kind. We have a history. It is not a comfortable one. How uncomfortable, she said. Another pause. He believes I owe him something, Dorian said carefully. A debt, from several centuries ago. It has been disputed. It remains unresolved. Centuries, Elena said. Our disagreements have a different time scale than most, he said. Something moved in his expression, not quite apology, but the consciousness of what he was asking her to absorb. I did not anticipate him coming here. He follows opportunities rather than schedules. I will deal with it. Will you tell me what it is? She said. He looked at her, at the honest, patient attention she brought to him, the willingness to be in this properly. He had been, she knew, alone with his complications for 8 centuries, and the habit of managing everything privately was deep and old. She could see him feeling the pull of it, the simpler, more familiar path of handling this himself and presenting her with only the outcome. Come here, he said instead, and turned them both away from the main street and into a quieter passage between 2 older buildings. He stood with his back to the wall and told her properly. The debt Marcus claimed was ancient. A choice Dorian had made 300 years ago in a dispute between 2 of their kind that had destroyed something Marcus had valued highly. Marcus's accounting of this was one version. There was another version, which was Dorian's, which was that the thing Marcus had valued had been built on violence and its destruction had been necessary, and the debt claimed was therefore illegitimate. This dispute had been escalating, slowly, across a century of encounters in various cities. Marcus collected grievances the way some people collected art, with patience and for the long term. What does he want? Elena said. To reclaim something of mine of equivalent value, Dorian said. His eyes moved to her face and stayed there. His definition of equivalent has changed since he became aware of you. The air in the passage went very still. He wants to use me, Elena said. He wants leverage, Dorian said, which is a different thing, but not a less dangerous one. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention. I need you to understand that I will not allow this. I also need you to understand completely what is in front of us. Elena stood in the cold January passage and felt something she hadn't expected, which was not fear, or not only fear but a distinct and grounding clarity, the kind that came when a situation stripped away everything optional and left you with only the real version of yourself. She thought about translation, about how the right word for a thing was always the most honest one. The word for what she was feeling was committed. Not in the romantic sense alone, in the solid, chosen, bones-deep sense. "What do you need from me?" she said. Dorian looked at her for a long moment. "Your honesty," he said. If what I am and what it involves is too much, if this is the point at which the real version of this life becomes something you can't choose, I need you to tell me. Truthfully. "I will understand. That's not what I asked," Alana said. "I asked what you need, not permission to let me leave." Something moved in his face. The control, very slightly, giving way. "I need," he said quietly, "to know you're safe, above everything else. Which means telling you all of it, even when all of it is considerable." "Then tell me all of it," she said, "and then we'll decide what to do together." He told her about Marcus, about the century of encounters, about what resolution might look like. Not violence, which Dorian was capable of but preferred to avoid, but a negotiation conducted at the level of their kind's long politics, the calling in of obligations from other ancient ones who'd witnessed the original events and could adjudicate. It was possible. It was not guaranteed. Elena listened to all of it, translated it in the way she always translated, not changing it to be more comfortable, but finding the right shape for it in her own understanding. When he finished, she asked 2 precise questions, and he answered them both, and she nodded. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay," he repeated, with the same tone as the first time she'd said it on her sofa, disbelieving and careful with the disbelief. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Marcus is a problem to be solved, not a reason for me to leave." She met his eyes. "I'm in this, Dorian. I decided that. I'm not undeciding it because it got complicated." He touched her face, both hands, with the particular careful reverence he brought to moments that mattered. Cool palms against her cheeks. "You should have been born in another era," he said quietly. "The ones that made use of people who were this brave." "I'm not brave," she said. "I'm just certain." He kissed her forehead. Long and still. When he lifted his head, his expression was everything she'd come to know in it. The depth, the patience, the particular joy he felt quietly rather than loudly, and something underneath all of it that was protective and decided and very old. "We'll handle Marcus," he said. "We will," Alana agreed. They walked back out onto the main street together, and the city went on around them with its ordinary January indifference, and Alana held Dorian's cool hand and felt the gravity of what they were walking toward, and found that it held. Marcus was resolved in February, in a manner that felt anticlimactic after a month of careful preparation, and then arrived, and was over in a single evening. Dorian had described it correctly. A negotiation, conducted in a language Elena didn't speak, in a building she wasn't present in, with 2 ancient witnesses whose names Dorian had told her, and she couldn't hold in her memory because they were too old for her mind to retain their weight. He had gone alone because her presence would have complicated the power dynamics in ways that couldn't be predicted. She had agreed to this, which had been its own decision, the decision to trust him to handle something completely, without her presence, as reassurance. She had waited in her apartment with a translation project open on her desk, and the useful professional discipline of someone who could focus when focus was required. She had managed 2 hours of solid work before giving up and reading the same page of a novel 5 times without retaining it. He was back by midnight. She heard the key. He had a key now, which had happened without discussion 3 weeks ago, the way some things between them happened, through simple and mutual necessity, and then his step in the hall, which was the step she knew now. The particular quiet of it. He came into the room, and she looked at him, and the answer was in his face before he spoke. The weight that had been present there for a month, not heavily worn, but consistently carried, was gone. Not replaced by lightness exactly, but by the ordinary evenness of his face, when nothing was pressing. "It's done," he said. She crossed the room. He caught her, arms around her, his face in her hair, and she felt the strength of him released from its most careful management. Just briefly. Just for her. Just in the privacy of the apartment, with the January wind outside. "Are you all right?" she asked against his shoulder. "Yes," he said. Yes." He held her for a moment longer. The claim was found to be without sufficient basis. The witnesses agreed. Marcus is bound by the judgment. A pause. He is not pleased. But he is bound. For how long? She said. "In our law, judgments of this kind are permanent unless new evidence presents itself," he said, "which there is none. He has no basis to pursue this further." He pulled back to look at her. "It's over." Elena released a breath she had been holding, in various ways, for a month. She put her hands against his chest, felt the stillness of him, the cool solidity. "Good," she said. "That's good." He took her face in his hands, the gesture she associated entirely with his most honest moments. "I'm sorry," he said, "that you had to carry that." "We carried it," she said. "Together. That's how this works." He looked at her with the layered eyes. "You're teaching me how this works," he said. "I should tell you I'm aware of that. 800 years, and I am being taught how partnership functions by a woman I've known for 4 months. You were overdue," she said. The not-quite smile, the real one, the one that reached his eyes. "I was," he agreed. Spring came and the city changed its light, and Elena's life reorganized itself around the fact of Dorian in it with the thoroughness of real change, which doesn't announce itself but simply gradually becomes the only arrangement you can remember. He was in her apartment most evenings. His books had acquired a shelf. His presence had acquired its particular corner of her life's arrangement, not taking it over, not reducing her to something that existed around him, but present in the way that mattered, which was consistent and honest and chosen every day. Her best friend Rosa met him in March. Rosa had a talent for assessing people that she'd developed professionally as a journalist and used personally as what she called self-protection. She met Dorian with the direct courtesy of someone reserving judgment, asked him several questions that were more pointed than they sounded, and received answers that she found, Elena could tell, genuinely unexpected. Afterward, Rosa pulled Elena into the kitchen under the pretense of helping with coffee. "He's unusual," Rosa said. "I can't get a read on him in the normal way." "No," Elena agreed. "He's devoted to you," Rosa said. "That one is completely clear. The way he tracks you when you move across a room, not possessively, not in that uncomfortable monitoring way, like she searched for it, like you're the orientation point, like you're the thing that tells him where everything else is." Elena thought about her mother saying the same thing with different words. "Yes," she said. Rosa looked at her for a moment, with the journalist's eye that saw through available surfaces. "There's something you're not telling me," she said. "There is," Elena agreed. "I will, when I can." A pause. He's good, Rosa. He's genuinely, carefully, significantly good. The rest is detail." Rosa looked at her for another moment, then nodded, with the nod of a woman who trusted Elena's judgment enough to let something go temporarily. "He'd better be," she said. "You're happy. I've been watching you be happy for 4 months, and I'm not going to be gracious about it if this falls apart." Elena smiled. "It won't." She said it with certainty, which surprised even her, not the hope dressed as certainty that she'd been accused of in past relationships, but something solid. Grounded. The certainty of knowing someone all the way down and having decided the answer was yes. By April, the word forever had stopped feeling impossible and started feeling like a direction. The conversation about forever happened in April, on a Sunday evening when the windows were open for the first time and the city smelled like rain and something green and beginning. Elena had been thinking about it for weeks in the quiet way she thought about important things, turning it over in her mind with the translation instinct, searching for the right words, the honest framing, the version that said the real thing rather than the available thing. She was sitting at her desk when Dorian arrived, and she heard him in the kitchen, making the tea he made for her, because he had learned how she took it, and when he brought it to her desk and set it at her elbow and went to the sofa with his book, she said, "I need to ask you something." He looked up. Patient. Present. His. "You told me," she said, "in the beginning, about the difficulty, that I would age, and you wouldn't, that there was a place you couldn't follow me." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "Is there any version of this in which that isn't the way it goes?" Dorian was quiet. A long quiet. She waited it out because she'd learned that his long quiets were the necessary approach to the truest answers. "Yes," he said finally. She waited. "Among our kind," he said, "there is the possibility of a full turning. A complete change. I told you I wouldn't ask it of you. I meant that entirely. It's not something I would ever choose for you without your choosing it fully for yourself." A pause. "And it's not a small thing, Elena. It's not a choice made lightly or with incomplete information. It changes everything that you are, everything about your life, everyone in it. Your mother, Rosa, the texture of the ordinary world." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't raise it because raising it feels like asking. And that cannot be, something I ask. But if I ask," she said. He held her gaze. "Then I explain it completely. All of it. Everything it would mean, and you take the time you need to understand it. And I don't push and I don't pressure and I don't." "Dorian," she said. He stopped. "I'm not asking tonight," she said. "I'm asking you to tell me. In full. So that I can understand what it is that I'm not being asked." A pause. "I want to know the shape of it. That's all. The shape, and then I'll think." He told her the shape of it. The how, which was intimate and permanent and required consent in its fullest meaning. The what, the change in her body, her needs, her relationship to daylight and time and hunger. The who would need to know, who could help her through the adjustment. What the community of their kind looked like as an environment for someone newly made. The how long the transition took, what recovery looked like. He told her the losses, and he didn't soften them. Her mother. He said this directly, and with the sorrow it deserved. She would outlive her mother by a considerable margin, would grieve her as mortals grieved, but without the ordinary mercy of time's erosion. Rosa. The people she worked with. The incremental drift of the ordinary human world that would continue changing while she continued not. He told her the gains, and was careful not to frame them as compensation. Time. In its genuine enormity, the specific freedoms of her changed body, strength, acuity, the particular sharpness of perception that came with the transformation. A partner, at full equivalence. 860 years of someone to walk alongside, who would not leave before she did. When he finished, she sat with it for a long time. He didn't fill the silence. He had never filled her silences, which was one of the many things about him that had made her feel, from the earliest weeks, that she was talking to someone who understood that thinking was not absence. "How long does it take?" she said finally. "The thinking, for people who have done this." "It varies," he said. "I would want you to take as long as it requires. Months. A year. There is no urgency. There is." His voice was careful and precise. "No version of this, in which my preference for a particular outcome influences your process. I need you to understand that." "I do," she said. She looked at him across the apartment, at the open windows and the spring evening, and the man sitting on her sofa, who had been reading the same page for the last 20 minutes because he was listening too hard to read. Dorian. "Yes, I love you," she said. "That part is not in question." He looked at her with the full depth of him. "I know," he said. "I love you. That is also not in question." "Good," she said. "Then we start from there." She thought about it for 4 months, not constantly, not obsessively, but steadily, in the way she worked through difficult translations, returning to it, setting it down, coming back with new light. She talked to Dorian about it in pieces, asking new questions as they arose. He answered all of them with the same patient fullness. She thought about her father, who had lived an ordinary life and died at 68, and who had, as Dorian said, understood that some things only worked if you didn't try to improve them. She thought about what her father had wanted for her, which was not longevity exactly, but fullness, presence, a life engaged with rather than managed from a distance. She thought about her mother, and that was the longest piece of thinking, and the most honest, and it lived in her chest like a specific weight that she carried, because it deserved to be carried and not set down. She thought about Rosa, who would be confused and then would not be confused, because Rosa was exceptional, and loyalty in Rosa was absolute, and if anyone could manage the revelation, it was her best friend, who had already sensed something she couldn't name, and had decided to trust Elena's judgment. She thought about the red dress in her wardrobe, kept for 2 years, because you weren't ready yet. About warm cider at a Christmas party. About a man on stone steps watching her without apology. About all the ordinary Tuesdays and Saturdays and rainy Thursdays that had built this specific and chosen and real thing between them, from nothing but attention and honesty and the willingness to be present. She told him in August, on a warm evening, in the apartment that had become as much his as hers in all the ways that mattered. She had made dinner, which was a thing she did, and he sat through with the same equanimity he brought to her mother's Sunday lunches, and after dinner they were on the roof of the building, because her building had a roof access she'd discovered in March, and they'd claimed it as theirs, in the implicit way they claimed things. The city spread around them in its summer evening form, warm light, distant noise, the smell of the river if the wind turned right. "I've decided," Elena said. Dorian turned from the city to look at her. He said nothing. She had his complete attention, as she'd had it since the churchyard, as she'd apparently always have it. "I've thought about all of it," she said. "The losses and the gains. My mother." She paused on that. "Let it be what it was. I've had honest conversations with myself about whether I'm doing this for the right reasons, not out of fear of losing you, not out of some romantic idea of forever that isn't grounded in the reality of what forever actually is." She looked at the city, at the old buildings in it that had survived their centuries. "And I keep coming back to the same thing." "What thing?" He said quietly. "That I am a person who kept a red dress in her wardrobe for 2 years," she said. "Because I wasn't ready yet. Not because I didn't want to wear it. Because I was waiting until the right moment for the right reasons." She turned to look at him. "I'm ready now. I want this. Not because it's romantic, not because I'm afraid of the alternative, because it is the most honest answer I have to the question of what I want my life to be." Dorian was very still. The August evening around them, the warm city, the particular quality of light. "Are you certain?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm certain." He took her hands, both of them, in his cool, deliberate ones. He looked at her with the full depth of him, the 8 centuries and the loneliness they'd held, and the careful management of a man who'd learned not to want things too specifically. And underneath all of it, so clearly she didn't need translation, love, specific and deep, and entirely for her. "I want you to meet the others," he said. "The ones who will help with the transition. I want you to have people, not just me, people who understand what this is." "Yes," she said, "all of it. I want all of it." He kissed her hands, both of them, with the reverence he brought to moments that were real. "Elena," he said, "you wore red to a funeral because you had nothing else, and I have been grateful for that specific shortage every single day since." She laughed, surprised by it, and the laugh was the one he watched most carefully, the unguarded one. He watched it the way he'd watched her from the churchyard steps, the way he'd watched her walk toward him across a week of Saturdays, with the focused and patient attention of someone for whom this was the most important thing in the room. The transition happened in September, carefully and with people Dorian trusted present, in the basement of a building he'd owned for 200 years. It was not painless, but it was not what she'd feared, not a loss of self, but a sharpening of it. She woke different and entirely herself. Sharper, as he'd described. The world recalibrated around her new perceptions with a vividness that was occasionally overwhelming and consistently extraordinary. Dorian was there when she opened her eyes. Right there, as she'd known he would be, because being where he said he would be was the most fundamental thing about him. She looked at him with the new eyes, saw him with the full perception of what she now was, the ancient depth of him, the power of him, and all of it organized entirely around her. "Hello," she said, her voice, the same voice, in a room that was sharper and more real. "Hello," he said, his voice as careful and warm as it had ever been. "How do you feel?" She considered this properly, because it deserved a proper answer. "Like everything is exact," she said. "Like the world was always this clear and I was missing the resolution." He smiled. The real one. The full one. The one she'd been accumulating toward since October of the previous year. "That fades slightly," he said. "You'll calibrate." "Good," she said. "It's a lot at once." She sat up, looked around the room, at the stone walls that had been here since long before she was born, at the people Dorian trusted sitting quietly nearby, at Dorian, who was watching her with the expression she knew down to its deepest layer now. "Is my mother? She's fine," he said. "She knows you're well. She'll see you next week, as discussed." Elena nodded. Her mother had been told, finally, last month in a long Sunday afternoon conversation that had been the most difficult and most necessary thing Elena had ever done. Her mother had cried, and asked questions, and held Elena's face in her hands the way mothers did, and then said with the directness of a woman who had buried her husband and kept going, "You're still you. Everything else is detail." Rosa had said, "Oh, thank God, that explains so much, I want to hear everything." Elena stood up, crossed to Dorian. He was watching her every step with the churchyard attention, the full weight of it. She stood in front of him and put her hands on his chest and looked up at him. "We have a long time," she said. "We do," he agreed. "What should we do with it?" He took her hands from his chest and held them properly, the way they'd stood on her roof in August, the warm city around them. "Everything," he said. "You make a list. I'll provide the centuries." She thought about her father at the Christmas tree with his glass of whiskey, about kindness pressed into warm cups, about kept dresses and the particular hope that keeping things expressed. About all of it, the ordinary Tuesdays and the extraordinary ones, the red dress and the funeral and the stone steps and the coffee shop and the roof in August and here, now, in this old room, with the man she'd built her life toward. She thought about 990 years, or however many it would be, and found that she was ready for all of them. "Rome first," she said. "You promised me Rome." Dorian smiled, her favorite version of his face. "Rome first," he agreed. "And then everything else." They walked out of the old building together and into the September night, and the city was sharper and brighter and more exact than it had ever been, and ahead of them the world was vast and full of things she hadn't translated yet, and Elena Vasquez, who had worn red to a funeral because she had nothing else, found that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She had been waiting for this. She just hadn't known what this was. Now, she did.